Today, Gaming America is speaking with Keith Whyte, the Executive Director of the National Council on Problem Gambling. We are speaking about the state of the issue right now in the country and what can be done to address it. Thank you for sitting with us today, Mr. Whyte.
Thank you, Cameron. It's great to be here.
Just to begin, I was wondering if you could give an account of the NCPG. What kind of work do you do and what do you set out to do?
The National Council on Problem Gambling was founded in 1972, which makes us, I believe, the oldest advocacy organization for people with gambling problems in the world. And we were started to be the voice, if you will, of the voiceless. You know, those people who suffered then and now in the shame and silence and stigma of a gambling addiction. So NCPG was created in 1972, and we were neutral on legalized gambling because we wanted to be a resource and a safe harbor for people with gambling problems. It also, of course, allows us to work with all the major stakeholders, which includes government as well as the gambling industry.
Mm-hmm. In search of an official comment, is the National Council on Problem Gambling opposed to the tide of legalization that is currently sweeping the nation?
You know, we are and have always been neutral on legalized gambling. So while we have strong opinions on how state government should regulate a new form of gambling, we have strong opinions on how sportsbook operators should have responsible gambling protections. You know, strong opinions on how the leagues should embrace this legalized gambling. We're not saying we're not for or against it. We work to minimize gambling-related harm, you know, with all the stakeholders. Not to say whether or not gambling should or should not be legalized in a particular state.
Sure. Now, with this coming of regulated gambling or legalized gambling, would you say that incidents of problem gambling are on the rise? And
yes,
as a second part to this question, though, is what sort of threats does online betting or online gaming pose to problem gambling that were not an issue a decade ago?
All right. Now, Cameron, it's a great question. Since 2018, our national surveys showed that the risk for gambling problems in the United States has increased by 50%. That is at least partly due to the expansion of sports betting. It's, of course, also overlapped with the pandemic. So there are certainly effects from the pandemic as well. But to the second part of your question, certainly the new forms of gambling in the United States, which include a rapid expansion of sports betting, online gambling, and of course, in-play betting are all associated with higher risk for gambling problems. And so we looked at the research from around the world. We looked at the experience of the UK. We looked at our own 5 decades of experience, and we predicted this increase in gambling problems unless aggressive measures were taken to mitigate that. And most states did not take those aggressive measures. So I think we are right where we predicted with our Safer Sports Betting Edition. I think we're right where we predicted in 2018 that our Safer Sports Betting Initiative said there would probably be an increase in the rate and severity of problems, you know, unless states really put a lot of money into preventing harm, and they haven't done so. And so I think we're right where we expected.
And you hold the states accountable and not, say, the gambling companies or any other stakeholders?
Well, I think responsibility is broadly shared. So while we have a lot of criticisms of state government, we certainly have a lot of criticisms of the operators as well. You know, we believe that problem gambling is a public health issue and everyone has a responsibility. Of course, those who regulate it at the state level and those who profit from it as an operator have a heightened responsibility. And in both instances, there are some states that are doing a very good job. There are some gambling companies that are doing some really innovative, responsible gambling. You know, there are states doing a good job of running problem gambling programs. So it's not all bad, but there are far more people that are treading water, or there are far more states that are not paying their share than there are folks that are leading.
Sure. My next question is also a two-part one. I was wondering, concerning the treatment of problem gambling, what are some tried and tested approaches to treating it? And on the flip side, what are some innovative approaches that maybe you guys are working on right now?
Well, I think tried and true in the United States is certainly counseling, and the preferred model is cognitive behavioral therapy, and counseling, especially alongside self-help groups like Gamblers Anonymous. So in both cases, if you in both counseling and self-help, if you stick with it, you have a very good chance of being abstinent or recovering from your gambling problem. And so these modes have been widely available across the United States. They're not always accessible or affordable. There are some states with limited GA meetings. GA is Gamblers Anonymous. There are some states that have no counselors with a gambling certification. There are some states where you can't get reimbursement from your private insurance company or from the state government to attend a counseling session. So availability, accessibility, and affordability are all things that are really challenging for people with gambling problems in the US healthcare system. But on the innovative side, if there's one good thing that came out of the pandemic, it is the emergence of telehealth as a treatment option for people with gambling problems. Telehealth solves a lot of those accessibility problems because it is, of course, available just about anywhere. You don't have to sit face to face with a counselor or in a group setting where you may still feel that shame and stigma, and it can be delivered in lots of different ways. So teletherapy is one of those innovative things that for people with gambling problems that's, I think, going to be very, very helpful.
Sure, sure. And what more could I know we mentioned the gambling companies or the gaming operators before. What more could they do in in the sort of apps they supply to the user?
There's so much the industry could do on responsible gambling. In some ways, this recent expansion is really a technological revolution. And the power of the apps is immense. And it really comes down to how the company tailors their apps, how they tune them to either be more socially responsible or more predatory. And that's a decision that in the United States context is really left up to the gambling companies, because our regulators generally are not involved in responsible gambling in a way that you would see in many other jurisdictions around the world. So our responsible gambling standards in most states are very, very light. There are still some states that don't provide any public funding to prevent or treat gambling problems. So in our context, a lot more of the responsibility falls on the operator to have good responsible gambling features in their app. The voluntary features that go far beyond what minimum standards the regulator requires, because that's the only way they're going to build a sustainable customer base.
So some of these companies are doing what they should be doing the right thing, you would say.
Yeah, and there's enormous potential to do even more. There's enormous potential to use the data that's collected to spot markers of harm. This is still entirely voluntary in the United States. Of course, other jurisdictions are making it mandatory. There's a lot you can do with behavioral nudges to encourage gamblers to set their limits, for example. There's a lot you could do with incentives and bonusing. As you know, right now in the United States, we're in the midst of a gambling expansion where bonuses for new players have been offered in the thousands of dollars. Even taking a tiny amount of that bonus and encouraging players to watch a risk video or set their own limits or to engage with the responsible gambling features on that app, we could incentivize players to do the right thing, which the industry acknowledges is in their best interests, both from a short-term perspective in terms of their reputation, and from a long-term perspective in terms of the sustainability. Yet, given all this responsible gambling potential, most of our operators are nowhere near living up to it. And as far as we're aware, no one's really doing any bonusing or incentivizing. Gamblers are left on their own to find the responsible gambling features and to adopt them, rather than being, it's sort of opt in rather than opt out. And I think there's a whole the difference between opt in and opt out is a difference of everything.
So would you say you see a lot of the problem in these promotions you mentioned? And these promotions often come right when gambling is, say, going live in a state for the first time. So would you say you see a lot of problem in that initial publicity push from gambling companies?
Yes, unfortunately, the culture of the United States is such that this advertising has very few restrictions. And for example, language around risk-free bets is incredibly popular. You know, we think risk-free bets, we don't support that language. You know, we think there's a lot of concerns around categorizing gambling as risk-free because it, of course, is not. What these really are you know, credits towards bets, and but they're certainly not risk-free. So we do see marketing spend tamp down once a market starts to mature. And so I don't know that these kinds of offers are going to be there for a long time or that they're necessarily sustainable. But at the moment, many Americans who are new to sports betting are being bombarded with ads that may have some additional negative impacts because of the way they're characterizing sports betting. So again, we would say if you want to build a sustainable sports betting market, leading with risk-free bets is probably not the best way to go about doing it because you're likely to attract some players who are at risk for gambling problems.
Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, would you say that with the rise in popularity of, I guess, sports betting particularly, because that seems to be the biggest thing, has advocacy such as what your group represent, has that grown in tandem? Like, is it keeping up with the rise in sports betting, would you say?
No, we've never been able to keep up with the industry. And so the revenues from legalized gambling are likely to top 125 billion. The budget of the National Council this year is $4 million for the entire United States. So we have grown, but it's not been proportionate or commensurate to the increase in gambling in the states. So we've got a long way to go to achieve that balancing of the costs and benefits. You know,
Sure.
the National Council has called for years the equivalent of 1% of the revenue from legalized gambling. So that would be roughly $1 to $1.5 billion a year in spend. And we are many orders of magnitude below spending 1% of legalized gambling revenue on programs to prevent and treat gambling addiction.
Sure. What about, well, my question is, do you think there's much that you in the United States could learn from abroad, from places like Europe or the UK, which are more mature markets for legalized gambling?
There's a tremendous amount that we have learned and we continue to learn from countries around the world. From Singapore to Switzerland, Australia to Austria. There's a lot of innovative, responsible gambling going on. Putting in the U.S. context, we are a very capitalist country with a pretty decentralized sense of regulation and a strong sense of individual rights and responsibilities. Putting some of the problem gambling programs that are effective in places like the UK and Canada into a US context is difficult, but we take a lot from the responsible gambling experiences. So responsible gambling, these are basically the programs and policies adopted by gambling companies to minimize harm. There's a lot that we've pulled on the responsible gambling side, especially from the UK and Canada. But on the problem gambling side, as your viewers are probably familiar with, healthcare is a privilege, not a right in the United States. So our gambling system is far behind the rest of the world and is unlikely to catch up anytime soon.
Yeah, sure. For my final question, just wrapping things up, I wanted to ask, and I know this is a bit idealistic in a way that you can't afford to be, but in a perfect world, how would the issue of problem gambling be treated in America?
No, it's a great question, Cameron. So our overall goal is to shape and change American public opinion. Because right now, while gambling is normalized in our culture, gambling addiction is still stigmatized. Most Americans see people with gambling problems as immoral, irreligious, weak-willed, and they see it as a personal problem. Whereas most Americans see alcoholism or someone who has a drinking problem as a public health issue. There's a lot of sympathy. They understand treatment and recovery works. So I think if we can normalize gambling addiction in our culture and have an open and honest conversation about it, that is going to go a long way towards making sure that states are putting the appropriate funds into prevention and treatment. That's going to go a long way to making sure companies operate responsibly, and it's going to go a long way towards having gamblers, protect themselves and utilize those responsible gambling tools. So right now, we're at an odd point in our history and our culture where gambling is now seen as acceptable, but problem gambling is still stigmatized. And in that change is what creates all the conditions that we want to see down the road with supportive responsible gambling, with supportive problem gambling programs and services.
Sure. Well, good luck. Good luck with what you're trying to do. It's very admirable. And thank you for speaking with Gaming America today. This has been Keith Whyte, the Executive Director of the National Council on Problem Gambling. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron, very much.